Hello, I'm Ashley Berner. I'm an associate professor at Johns Hopkins and the deputy director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy, here to talk about why school choice is a strange term, America's schools in international context. But before I get started, I do want to pause and thank our colleagues who are at the School of Medicine and the School of Public Health. You all are on the front lines, both in terms of urgent patient care and also in research day and night to try to solve this modern day plague. And in fact, your work makes this talk feel like a luxury. So thank you for all of your service. And I also want to thank those of you who've joined remotely. It's a pleasure to meet you virtually. I hope we can engage over the next hour and then beyond. It's hard for me to not have the back and forth that I'm used to. So what I'm going to do is talk for maybe 35 minutes and then have Q&A and deal with what you're thinking about with this topic and other related educational topics. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. I have been a classroom teacher in contexts as diverse as a Jewish preschool and now all the way into the EDD program here at Hopkins. But my intellectual background is in modern history, specifically studying the history of ideas and why some ideas migrate from the fringes of society, where we see them and debate them, into part of our social imagination, part of our culture, so that we don't even question them. Well, what does that have to do with education policy? So my doctoral studies took place at Oxford University, and I was studying the history of teacher prep programs in England over a 100-year period. So I was looking at archives, development of educational theory, and by implication, how education was constructed over time in England. And at the same time, I had two daughters who were in an English school. So through the lens of a scholar and the lens of a mother, I found myself face to face with an entirely different way of doing public education. And as a matter of fact, it took me to examining school systems all around the world and finding out that our system is very different, that in fact, in many ways, the United States notion of public education is anomalous among our democratic peers. So, and that this difference has profound consequences for how we do public education, education policy, and apropos this conversation, to how we argue about education policy in this country. So in the next couple of minutes, I'd like to talk through how we're different from other countries, why we're different from other countries, and why it matters and what we can learn from them. Specifically, how our differences kind of season our debates about charter schools, about choice, about what the nature of public education is in the first place. All of these things are culturally contingent, and elevating that gives us an opportunity to learn from other systems and from ourselves as well, of why we are as we are. Before I get going, I do feel compelled to say that intellectual history and education policy have something in common, which is they're both complex and they're both nuanced, and details matter. So as soon as you hear a researcher saying this will work, it may have worked in one context and not in another, or these policies don't work. Well, it depends. It always depends. So please bear in mind, as I'm talking about very high level, large concepts, that when we start to talk about details, you will see nuance because they're there. So how are our systems different, and why are they different, and why does it matter? So let me play my first slide. They're different because we have a system structured around educational uniformity. Now, uniform school systems do not mean that our schools are uniform in terms of outcomes. We know that our schools produce very, very different outcomes in terms of academic achievement, academic attainment. We know that they're resourced differently. We know that they are very inequitable in many ways. But when we're talking about the structure of education, educational uniformity means only the state delivers public education, traditionally, historically, in this country for 100 years. Only the state delivers public education. The United States has had uniform school systems since the late 19th century, which we'll talk about in a little while. But in fact, many of our state constitutions have the term uniformity built into the education statutes, a uniform public school system. Other countries, by contrast, structure education in a way that we call educational pluralism, meaning the government funds and regulates but doesn't necessarily deliver public education. So they structure education to incentivize and enable all different kinds of schools, philosophically, theologically, pedagogically, different schools. And very critically to this argument, they hold them all accountable for academic results. Now, just to make this real, let me give you 3 examples. There are many, because again, this is by far the democratic norm, but the Netherlands funds 36 different kinds of schools on equal footing. They fund Jewish Orthodox, Jewish Reform, Catholic, Montessori, secular. They also fund what we would call district schools. In fact, 30% of the kids in the Netherlands attend what we would call district schools. The government also funds teacher prep programs that differ. They also help schools choose textbooks and so forth that are different in terms of ethos, but they are relentless in insisting on a high bar academically and common content. So that's one example. The Netherlands even has educational freedom built into its constitution. Another example is Alberta, Canada, which is one of my favorite school systems. I just served on a ministerial panel there to look at their curriculum. Alberta is one of the highest performing school systems in the world in terms of academic outcomes and equity, that is helping first generation kids achieve. It didn't used to be that way, but in the 1990s, Alberta underwent what we could call a grand bargain. They did 3 things simultaneously. First, they expanded school choices, for want of a better term. They had always funded Catholic and Protestant schools. They started to fund Inuit schools, Jewish schools, more secular schools, even Inuits, even homeschooling. Homeschoolers get a stipend in Alberta. But that wasn't all they did. They also put in place a very rigorous academic curriculum that all the schools have to teach. And this is critical, they reallocated property tax funding so that schools were not dependent upon their local population's wealth. So those 3 things together, that grand bargain, helped catapult Alberta to one of the highest performing school systems in the world. One more example, Australia. Australia has, as we do, they have a provincial school system in which, we have a state school system. The education policy is largely done at the state level, not the federal level. But about 20 years ago, the government noticed that independent schools were having an outsized positive impact on low-income kids' achievement. And so they started to provide scholarships for low-income kids to attend private schools or independent schools. And it's a very complicated mechanism, but to cut to the chase, about a half of the kids in Australia's independent schools are from the lowest sector of the economy in terms of their family's wealth. So these are just a few examples. Israel, Indonesia, Hyderabad, India, Poland, a lot of countries have educational pluralism as a structure. So I think my point in all that is to say there are many different and very legitimate ways to organize democratic education. We are used to what we know, which is normal, but it's not the only way to organize democratic education. So let me talk for a moment about that's the how they're different. Let me talk a little bit about the rationale behind this, of how do you justify educational pluralism? And here we have to look at political theory, we have to look at educational theory, and we have to look at research. So I'm going to go very, very quickly here. But how does educational pluralism justify itself. So the first premise is that education can't be neutral, can't be morally neutral. So the state should fund a variety of schools. Those of you who've worked in schools know that every element of a school is chosen at some level. The curriculum, the disciplinary code, the admissions policies, the hiring policies, all of these things reflect certain norms. And so educational pluralism as a theory simply says, because this is so, we can't fund just one kind of school, we need to fund many different kinds of schools. The second premise is really about political theory. Now, political theorists have to work out what belongs in what bucket, as it were. So in a society, in a free society, you have individuals and individual families, individual pursuits. You have the state, which is, the government at various levels. And then you have civil society, or the kind of nonprofits and the voluntary things that we engage with that are not the state and not individuals exclusively. So a uniform school system, a uniform delivery system, says only the state can really deliver public education. It belongs firmly within the control of the state in very different levels, democratically elected school boards. I'm not, a totalitarian society would have a very different notion of the state here. But in our country, democratic elections can lead to school boards, and schools are not run in a coercive fashion, but there's only one delivery and it belongs in the state. Very long theory justifying this, which I'm happy to talk about. Interestingly, in our country, when we look at our education policy debates, we see both poles at play, individualism and the state. So we have powerful constituents in this country that assert that only the government can deliver education properly, and that can be justified in many ways. And then we also have a libertarian wing that asserts that education is really within the control, or should be within the control, of the individual family, and that individual family decision-making should be the only quality control mechanism. But educational pluralism says, well, not really, and I'll touch on that in a moment. Education isn't just about the individual. So it belongs in civil society. One quick example of this, Hong Kong. The government has always funded all different kinds of schools, but they are delivered by the voluntary sector. One more example, in the UK, the majority provider of elementary schools is the Anglican Church. But Catholic schools are right behind there. And about 20 years ago, the chief rabbi, Sir Jonathan Sacks, noticed that only about 12% of the Jewish kids in the UK attended Jewish day schools. And there were many reasons to be concerned about that. So the Jewish community in the UK went on a fundraising mission and were able to create enough schools. Let me tell you how this worked at the time. The government would fund 80% of the capital cost of a new school, and the voluntary sector would provide 20% of the original capital cost. The state would continue to pay all the operating costs. So by the time Rabbi Sacks left office, about 70% of Jewish kids in the UK went to state-funded Jewish day schools. Third premise, that all kids, all should have options for their children. All families should have options for their children. Now, we do have school choice in this country for families who can move to a suburb and enroll their kids in a school that they like, or who can send their children to a private school. And I think what educational pluralism tries to argue is that at its best, public education should make as much flexibility and responsiveness available for as many families as possible. There are 1,000 different reasons why a given school might not be best for a given child. It doesn't necessarily have to do with the resources of the school. It could have to do with the school culture. It could have to do with the school's extracurriculars, proximity, all kinds of pedagogical approaches. And the premise of pluralism is that we should make those options available for as many kids as possible. Now, when you actually start working on education policy, we see that there are all kinds of barriers to this happening. You can't really have meaningful options if you cannot get across town because you don't have a car. So there's always this equity issue, and no school system has really solved that satisfactorily. I'm just telling you here what the philosophical justifications are. The fourth justification for educational pluralism, it goes back to this notion of the individual, the state, and civil society. Educational pluralism says, in no uncertain terms, education isn't just an individual good. It's not just up to individual families, what they want, what kind of education they want, but education, unlike other areas of life, is common to all of us. And it matters to me that your child knows how to read, that your child knows how to engage in civil society and democratic life. It matters to you that my children know how to participate in the workforce and know how to ask questions about meaning and purpose. So this is really an important point. This notion of common good is what justifies accountability structures. Back to our debates in American policy, a lot of times you will hear an argument against external or state or common accountability purposes outside of the individual. And educational pluralism says that's not quite good enough. So I'm happy to talk during the Q&A about how these accountability systems work in other countries, but it's a very important point. Educational pluralism isn't a free-for-all. It isn't just about what individuals want, because we share in our democratic culture together. The fifth is actually about fifth justification or premise of pluralism is actually about the research and about the policies. When it's designed well, when it's designed to maximize the excellence of an educational system through a strong, knowledge-rich curriculum and knowledge-based assessments, for example, and when families are empowered to make decisions for their children, that it can benefit students academically and civically. Now, this is not a given. Again, back to this notion of nuance and policy details, there is no black and white here. You will find inequities and lapses of excellence in pluralistic systems, just like you will in uniform systems. It's a question of how they're designed from the ground up and what kind of nimbleness and flexibility they can enact. But there's no perfection here. But when you look at the research, and this is true of educational research in different countries and also of school research in this country, that when schools drive academics to a very high level and have an academically rich curriculum, and they have a very strong normative school culture that's distinctive and that brings the families together, those two things, a strong curriculum and a strong school culture, can really have an outsized positive impact on students, not just on their academic attainment and achievement, but on their civic behaviors in the long term. So let me just pause for a minute here and say that this is something that our institute at Hopkins takes very seriously, that if the research says that a strong curriculum really matters and that a strong school culture really matters, that is sector agnostic. That applies whether you're in a Jewish school, a Catholic school, a district school. And in fact, there are initiatives right now that actually advance these in all different kinds of schools in this country. So I'm going to pause for a minute and turn to the history. So that's how they're different. Why are they different? Very, very briefly, the United States used to have plural systems. We used to fund in our states, in our big cities, many different kinds of schools, Catholic schools, Congregationalist schools, secular schools, common Protestant schools. The origins of the common school movement were about bringing together different Protestant kids. We also had de facto Jewish schools in some of the boroughs of New York. And Americans, by all counts, let me bracket this, Americans who were free to choose an education, we can't forget this, those Americans who were free to choose an education liked having this local control and this diversity of offerings dependent upon the demography of the area. And Horace Mann was the first commissioner of education in Massachusetts, 1830s and 40s. He began to argue for a uniform school system at the state level that was able to create a uniform common school experience for all children. Interestingly, Horace Mann was met with resistance initially for the reasons that I just cited, flew in the face of local control and of religious liberty and diversity, which they wouldn't have called it diversity then, but that notion was still there until something happened in the 19th century that made a uniform model appealing. It's very interesting. What was that? That was the influx of millions of Catholic immigrants. And from the 1840s, 1850s, and so on, by far, the greatest majority of the immigrant population were from Catholic countries. And they, in some cases, overwhelmed the demography of certain cities, like Boston was almost 50% Catholic. Philadelphia, even in the West, there were quite a lot of Catholics who expected to receive funding for their schools. And indeed, they received that. They received tax funding from their local municipalities to have Catholic schools, as they had in the former countries and as we had in this country for a long time. But there was a problem with so many Catholics in the mind of the Anglo-Saxon Protestant majority. As you know, cultural majorities don't always see themselves as such. They don't see how chosen their own views are. And the Anglo-Saxon Protestant majority really did not believe that Catholics could be good citizens. So one of those interesting moments where you can say, wow, things have really, imagine that. This became a central plank in a nativist movement that was actually very prominent before the Civil War and then again after the Civil War. And this nativist movement was anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, and anti-Catholic schools. It was a very interesting alliance between grassroots kind of populist movement. In fact, the Ku Klux Klan was virulently anti-Catholic and firebombed Catholic neighborhoods and churches and so forth. And then the Know Nothing Party in the mid-century and after the Civil War, the Republican Party built this into its political platform. And what we see, to make a very long story short, is that between the end of the Civil War and in 1910, state legislature after state legislature passed laws that defunded and delegitimized Catholic schools through the guise of religious schools. So there are a lot of statutes. 36 of our state constitutions have statutes that forbid funding for religious schools. Ironically, those same legislatures required Protestant Bibles and Protestant prayers to be said in schools. So these common schools, the uniform delivery model, was in effect Protestant until the Supreme Court, I believe quite rightly, secularized the district schools in the 1960s. So the point is that we used to have a different school system, but we've had a uniform delivery model for so long that we've identified public education with one thing, the district school. And that's had profound consequences for how we think about public education and for how we argue about education. So our whole debate is framed in these terms. We're picturing public education as one thing. And so any alternative to district schools have to justify themselves in some fashion. And for a very long time, there was only a small percentage of families in this country who sent their kids to private schools. But in the last 25 years, we have seen, for various reasons, a variety of alternatives to the district model. We have, and I'm going to share a map of what we see in the United States right now. Every state that's yellow has what's called a charter law. Charter schools are public schools that are funded by the government, but delivered and run by non-district entities. In many cases, they are in partnering with districts. We have some districts in this country, for example, DC, where 50% of the schools are charter schools and 50% are district schools. There are Miami-Dade has a wide variety of school types. We also, those other colored dots are other kinds of programs. I'm happy to go into the details of all of those, but more and more states have various programs that allow particularly low-income kids to attend, say, private schools or charter schools. Florida and Indiana are, and to some extent Louisiana, but particularly Florida and Indiana have a lot of programs, and also have some of the accountability measures that we see in pluralistic systems by way of common assessments or nationally normed assessments, school visits and site inspections, things like that, that other countries have as well. So that's the kind of general broad brush what's happening. Things are changing, things are shifting around. But even in states like Florida, where there are lots and lots of charter schools and lots of private school choice programs, it's still bitterly contested. And so anyone, I know there may be people listening who have worked in, say, charter schools, but in some states, it's actually, quite bitter. The debates about charter schools, about legitimacy, about who should have funding. And even though there may be collaborations happening at the local level, at the state level, and I will give a few examples of that, we still see a lot of adults fighting, a lot of bitter debates. We even see the leadership of different constituents diminishing entire school sectors. So we will find district schools talking about how illegitimate charter schools are. We'll find pro-voucher families and advocates talking about failing district schools. And it's very striking how vitriolic our debates are. Let me just give you a contrast. One of my colleagues in the UK, Jonathan Sharples, runs the equivalent of the Institute for Education Sciences here. And I asked him at one point, what do you think about the Catholic school effect? And have you studied the Jewish school effect? Because you have a lot of Jewish day schools, meaning what are the differences in outcomes between these sectors? And he said, no one's ever asked me that question. Why not? Because they fund all different kinds of schools, and the job of the state is to help all schools improve. And so in England and the Netherlands and various other countries, they're sector agnostic in terms of what counts, but they're not agnostic when it comes to quality. So it's that both and. And so, of course, they debate about education, but they don't have the kinds of debates that we do where there's a kind of zero-sum game. Now, this affects even research. I can tell you that research on educational outcomes is just as contested. And oftentimes you see policymakers weaponizing their research and mistrusting one another's research instead of using it for continuous improvement. So again, I see these as consequences of our particular history, our particular culture, especially now that we're actually shifting and changing the models in different places. But I would say, as someone who works in school systems of all different kinds, one of the sad consequences of these political debates, which are like a microcosm of what we see nationally politically, is that it keeps us from really honoring the good work that's going on in different sectors. So, for example, Baltimore City, Dr. Santelises, who is the CEO of Baltimore City Public Schools, has been heroically putting a really strong curriculum in front of her students and helping teachers to deliver it. That's remarkable. The Archdiocese of Baltimore is serving a wide variety of kids in the city as well, and they're trying to improve the school cultures and the climates in their schools. We have charter schools that are doing great things to close the achievement gaps between wealthy and poor, and we have Islamic school accounting body, accrediting bodies that are trying to make sure that all of their schools are high quality. So there are really, really good things going on in all of our in all of our states, and it's refreshing to be able to pull back and really celebrate those, and at least as a policymaker. So let me just, I know I've gone on for about half an hour, but let me just close by saying, what is, I guess, from my perspective, what's the value? What's the value of looking at our history and looking at how other countries do it and why? And I think, of course, as an historian, it's interesting to see how some ideas migrate. This idea of a common uniform school system changing based on the facts on the ground and the response of the nativist movement and so forth. Incidentally, other countries in the 19th century had a simultaneous shift in the opposite direction. So these systems change, and I find that fascinating. But I think from the standpoint of education policy, we have so much to learn from other countries. Obviously systems are different. You can't just take something that worked in the Netherlands and slap it down here. But there are things that we can learn by looking at our peers around the world. What works? What doesn't work? What do we want to avoid? And I can point to examples of school systems that have done that. Our institute has a formal partnership with the European Association of Education Law and Policy, and we publicize reports about different countries and how they structure their laws and how they do their citizenship and so forth. Recently, in the face of this COVID, I'm just going to show you the cover, the return. It's a paper that we just published, our institute, with Chiefs for Change. Chiefs for Change is a membership organization of commissioners of education and district superintendents. And we had this notion that it was how we could draw from other countries' experiences in thinking about crises. How do we prepare for crises next time? How do we help our kids, support our kids? What can we learn by looking at school systems that have a different school calendar, for example? How can we learn from their approach to school culture? How can we learn from their approach to curriculum? So these are opportunities that we have. So that's why I think there's a value, not just from an intellectual standpoint, but from a policy standpoint. And then finally, I would say, as a citizen in a liberal democracy, I suppose I have the naive hope that when we learn about other countries and we think about how our country could have been different or maybe is changing, that it would inject a little bit of humility into our political discourse, that we can actually, leaders can start to put their weapons down and make more generous space for leaders who are doing really good things in all different kinds of schools. We'll close with a very positive example. I gave the point earlier, the example of Alberta, Canada, and how they interacted did a grand bargain around funding, around curriculum, around assessments, around educational choices. It was a grand bargain. And looking at that, it's easy to get kind of to feel disheartened by how we don't have a lot of political compromise right now. But the state of Illinois in 2017 had the closest thing to a grand bargain in education that is I can remember in recent memory. They redistributed, well, they funded district schools at a much higher level. They redesigned their funding mechanism and funded district schools, particularly Chicago public schools, at a higher level. They passed the state's first education tax credit, which is a way for corporations to donate money for low-income kids to attend private schools. And they required all of those kids to take the state assessments. So that was not put in terms of educational pluralism, but it does show that political compromise is possible and that it actually good things may happen for kids. So that's the end of my comments for right now. I really want to thank you for your attention, and I am eager to know what kind of questions you have on your mind. Okay. Doesn't having religious schools that are free and everywhere, doesn't this encourage proselytizing? I can imagine lots of families sending their kids to the closest school rather than commuting to a secular one. That's a really good question. Just say very briefly, if you think about schools as not being neutral, then immediately you realize that as they would say in the UK, pluralism is different from secularism. Secularism is very important, but in terms of the moral framework of a school, it's not necessarily not the only legitimate school. But it's not just about religion. Religious schools are only one of many options in pluralistic systems. I'm going to return to the US in a minute, but Sweden has per capita funding now for their schools. And because it's a very secular country, only 3% of their schools that are funded, that are non-state schools, are religious because they have a very secular population, and those families want a different kind of atmosphere. But about proselytizing, I think that the Supreme Court has been fairly clear that religious schools can be funded by the state under certain circumstances. So if there's a general law and there's a general educational law that has a secular purpose, namely advancing education, and the money does not go directly to the school, the religious school or the Montessori school or the prep school, but it goes to the families for them to choose, that it's constitutional from a federal perspective and it doesn't violate the establishment clause. I guess I think the other answer to your question, which is the right question. So the first answer is it is constitutional from a federal perspective, but from a personal perspective, educational pluralism does imply that we will be funding schools that we wouldn't send our own kids to. You know, that was actually reading the education policy debates in Parliament when they passed their first bill to fund education. There was a lot of debate about that. What if we're funding error? What if we're funding people to do things that we think, isn't right? Well, that has to be part of it. There are some schools we wouldn't send our own children to that we in pluralism would say they still have a right to exist. Now, there are certainly some schools that should be off limits, and that's a whole other question, and that's not something that any school system that is pluralistic has solved completely. Certainly in our country, a school that was racially charged would not have legal standing. In fact, it doesn't now, theoretically, Supreme Court. So that's a very long answer to, yes, I think there would be schools funded that were evangelical or that were Islamic, and that is those that in a pluralistic system, families could certainly choose those schools. You'd have to decide what what kind of limits are placed on there, and different countries have different limits. I'm happy to follow up on that later if you would like. Okay, this question is from Colleen. Would educational pluralism lead to racial segregation? All right, well, this is a really complicated question. It's the right question because we've had a structural racism in our country has meant that we have had racially segregated schools. Uniform school systems have created, residentially zoned school systems that are very segregated. Sometimes we have schools that are in terms of their population, are integrated racially and socioeconomically, but actually internally have a real division of how children are sorted. And I think education policy is between a rock and a hard place with this, because we have the moral imperative to create a society in which families are we're not segregating people according to socioeconomics and racial categories. At the same time, well, first of all, no school system in the world has really solved this problem. At the same time, I do want to note that there is a strong movement that says parents should be the ones making the decisions on behalf of their children, not policymakers. So when you look at some cities like Minneapolis, St. Paul's, they have a lot of charter schools. A lot of the charter schools are culturally affirming. They have African-American charter schools. They're secular, but they really focus on affirming African-American kids. And there are some analogous schools for Latino kids. They're charter schools, so they're open to everyone. But I would not want to tell a parent, and the civil rights community is very much behind many of these schools. I wouldn't want to tell a parent you can't enroll your child in a school that you think is good for them, nurturing of them. So I think that's a really complicated situation. I certainly can't say that anyone has solved it. We need to keep that in mind as we're constructing policies. I think there's a lot of a promise around this notion of intentionally socioeconomically designed schools. So Rich Kallenberg and Hallie Potter at the are working with school systems that are charter school networks that are intentionally integrative of different socioeconomic status kids. Okay, next question. Okay, this is from Brenda. Could you talk more about how school accountability works in pluralistic systems? Yeah, so it varies. Accountability systems typically have several different levers. They have common curriculum frameworks, or they have common assessments, or they have site inspections or site visits. Let me just talk about those really briefly. So Alberta, Canada has curriculum frameworks and specific content that all kids have to master. It doesn't matter if they go to if they're homeschoolers, if they are in an Inuit school or a Catholic school, and this information can be delivered through many, many different lenses, can be interpreted in many different ways, but the kids still have to learn the content. And there's a very strong body of research, both in this country and around the world, that would say that a knowledge-rich content-rich curriculum that actually requires kids to know something in particular actually narrows achievement gaps between wealthy and poor kids. So systems like Alberta they fund all different kinds of schools, but they require all the kids to learn the same content and to take a common assessment. The Netherlands does the same. The Netherlands actually has a split assessment track where a child's end of year grade is divided up between how they do on the national exam, which for us would be like a state exam, and that's content specific, and then how they do on their end of their school exam. And those, I think it's 60-40. And so you may have schools that actually are teaching kids something through a different lens, and they have to know for the national assessment, but they still have to know the same content. That's, I think, probably curriculum and assessments are the most promising way to do accountability, actually transferable to this country in certain ways. The inspectorates that are highly effective, at least at setting a high bar for everyone. What I like about inspection systems is that they look at multiple measures of a school's quality, not just the assessments. So in the UK and the Netherlands, which are probably the best, in the UK, the ministers of inspection go in with 27 different measures in mind. So they look at school, they visit classrooms, they do school culture surveys, they interview parents, they interview the board, and they come up with this really rich analysis of how the schools are doing. And those have to be, by law, publicly posted. And these schools have to hold parent conferences and, open town hall meetings with information about how the school's doing. And again, in those systems, they are sector agnostic. They don't ding you harder if you're a certain kind of school. And in fact, if there's a religious school that's funded, then the religious education piece is assessed separately. There are national standards that every school has to go along with. So actually, we've published on this. You can look on our website and see. Okay, here we go. This is from Sophia. Would state and federal funding of all schools serve as a means of ensuring equity in terms of the quality of education provided by religious schools? Oh, okay. Well, there are a couple things in that question. State and federal funding of all schools. First of all, education policy is largely a matter of the state, for the states, at least in the way that our laws are constructed. I don't know that I would feel great about a federal funding for all schools. Right now, the federal funds flow through the civil rights legislation, primarily to low-income students. But I think this question of if states funded all different kinds of schools, first of all, because of the way our constitutions work, they could never, I don't foresee the kind of block funding for religious schools that we see in the UK and the Netherlands and so forth. Because of the way our establishment clause works, it would be an indirect funding along the lines that the Supreme Court has laid out in Zellman and in previous decisions. I think that, well, whatever the mechanism, having equal funding through many mechanisms might help with equity, but I don't think it would solve the problem of quality, which is equally important. And here, I mean, I think you need funding needs to be tied. Now I'm speaking of best practices in a pluralistic system. Funding would be tied to accountability and specifically academic outcomes. And this is where pluralists get crosswires with libertarians, because the libertarian school choice movement would simply say in this country, parents' decisions to enroll their children is the only accountability measure we really need. And a pluralist would say, well, that's not quite good enough. I'm going to quote Charlie Glenn, who's the foremost scholar in this area. And he was worked for the great state of Massachusetts Department of Education and was in charge of their Office of Excellence and Equity. And he said, and I've never forgotten this, it is an appropriate goal of public policy to make sure that there are no failing schools. Yes, parents are important, but again, if we're all in this together and education is a common good, I think funding, however it's construed at whatever level, should absolutely be tied to quality. Incidentally, I'm guessing Sophia Asmat is the one who posed that question. She is tasked with accrediting Islamic schools. So thank you for joining the conversation, Sophia, and for what you're doing for quality. This is a very good question. from Deborah. What do you make of the fact that schools in states as different as California and Texas teach varying versions of American history? How problematic is this? This is another area that our institute at Hopkins works on, is the actual knowledge that is taught in school. And in English language arts curriculum, we're now doing social studies. And I very much want to look at the frameworks of those two states. It's very, very shrewd that interesting that you mentioned those. I do think it's a problem. I don't think we will ever have a national curriculum. We certainly can't. It's not possible to have a national curriculum in terms of content. I guess what I would say is this. My ideal, if I'm looking at, say, the UK or Alberta, Canada, would be to have certain in history, certain domains of history that every student needs to be able to master and speak to. And by the time they're in high school, they should certainly be called upon to give different interpretations of the same thing. And I think that would be incredibly valuable if we had the equivalent. Well, I suppose AP exams play that role to some extent, and IB exams play that role to some extent. But one can imagine something more like what they have in France or the UK, where there is a university accrediting body that poses these really important exit exams and say that will ask specific questions about history and ask students to respond, and they have to demonstrate knowledge of the facts, and then they can bring in their interpretive lenses. But I think I would love to follow up with you on that, because I think about this all the time as an historian, as someone who studies curriculum. But I also want to point out that we're really in bad shape when you think about the education that we're providing in every state. The NAEP scores, which is our national assessment for educational progress, come out every few years, and they just released the scores on American history, government, and civics. And the percentage of 4th, 8th, and 12th graders who were deemed proficient in these subjects hovers at 20% and below. So whatever we're doing, we're not doing it well. And anyway, please write me separately and we can follow up on that, because I'd love to talk about it. Okay. Here's a question from Gerald. What about the argument that you would be hurting district schools if you fund charters and private school scholarships? Wow. Yeah, that's a difficult question. I mean, there are different mechanisms here, and well, let me back up. I guess I would urge us to step back from the brink of a zero-sum game, that because person A gets something, person B gets less. There is an awful lot of evidence that a very pluralistic school system in which there's no one lead provider actually can benefit all kids. And that's true internationally. And when we actually look at the interaction between different school systems in this country, sometimes we see the same thing. So David Figlio, who's the Dean of Education at UC Irvine, Northwestern. Sorry, David. David's at Northwestern. Did some really interesting studies of the tax credit programs in Florida, and found that, and when there were a lot of different options in, say, Miami-Dade, the kids who left the district school to go to private schools benefited academically. The kids who stayed in the district schools benefited academically too, because there was more education dollars following the child, fewer children. There was more education dollars, instructional dollars that were following fewer kids. There's a lot of budgetary work around fixed versus variable costs. We need to take a close look at that. Again, it depends on the kind of program. Tax credit program in Florida, the state of Florida has analyzed it every year and has actually saved the state money. So I think there's a sweet spot in which we're not harming district schools and we're empowering other schools. And I think, again, I would just say if we can get away from this notion that there's only one legitimate kind of school and then it's all a zero-sum game, we actually may be able to do some incredible partnerships and to affirm all different kinds of schools. But that's a really tough one. Okay, I've got only a couple of minutes left. Are there any other? Oh, here's one from Ray. Okay, here's a question from Ray. You think and write a lot about the vitriolic nature of the debate regarding schools. Does the emphasis placed on test scores as the measure of quality feed this vitriol? Well, that's a really interesting question. Test scores. So I think there is a lot of contention around tests. And I think in part that's because, first of all, I do believe in assessments. I do believe that we need to know how kids are doing, and especially we need to know how the kids, kids in first generation kids are doing. It really matters. It matters to all of us. And Common Core and Race to the Top and all of these initiatives that were started by governors, by the way, and not the federal government, really we're trying to get at that. We need to make sure no kids falling behind, the no child left behind, at least the premise. But what happened in the way that tests were rolled out was that they were very much tied to teacher evaluations. And so immediately we had this wedge between the teachers who were really, working with kids day in and day out, and they see the limitations and constraints and the resource issues, and they're working hard and they're evaluated on their kids' test scores. Some of that makes some sense, but in a way, it really drove a lot of division in the field. And this is, again, why I like content-rich assessments, because content-rich assessments place an equal burden on kids to learn real material, concrete material, not just on the teachers to teach disaggregated skills. I think the contests really have to do a lot with power and the sense of legitimacy. When you think about it, someone who founds a charter school is having to make the case for an exception to the uniform delivery. And that feels threatening from a cultural and political and to some extent, perhaps economic standpoint. And again, I just keep thinking if we could get away from this oppositional stance, we might have a better time and our kids might do better. Let's see if there's another question. I really appreciate these questions. That's actually, I think that's the last question. Let me give you my email address. It's ashley.berner@jhu.edu. And if you had a question that didn't get answered, because there are a lot of questions. Oh, wait, is there another one? Wait, 1 second. One more question. Do you believe that adopting a model nationally, like we have in Maryland, where charter schools are part of the local collective bargaining units, would move the needle in a more positive direction? Okay, so really quickly, most state laws about charter schools vary considerably, and they vary considerably in the results that they produce, if you're going to look at results. Morgan, I don't think that would move the direction in a positive way. I think that, I don't know, there needs to be, let me just speak to the research very quickly. The research shows that in some areas where charter schools are independently operated and where they are held to a high standard like Massachusetts, they virtually close the achievement gap. And that's really important information. It doesn't happen everywhere. There's variability in charter outcomes, but nationally, the larger CMOs, the larger charter management organizations, in the aggregate, tend to do a better job just because they have more practice. Oh no, it's time to stop. I'm so sorry. Morgan, please write me and let's continue the conversation. Thank you all so much. I really, really appreciate your joining, and I look forward to more follow-up. Thank you.